In this video, we will be looking at an interesting rook endgame, where the attacking side has a pawn about to promote on the next move, but their own rook is in the way. Normally this problem is easily resolved by moving the rook, but in this endgame, the defending side has their rook watching our pawn, ready to take it if that were to happen. Because of this, the white rook is stuck in its place blocking the pawn. So if white does not know the right techniques to use to win this endgame, then the game will end in a draw. So in this position, can you find the winning move? The move is rook g8, which is a check, meaning that black has to move their king, and does not have time to take the pawn. And now we can promote and enter this winning king and rook versus king endgame. I made a video about how to win this endgame, so you can check that one out later. This position is just the very basic of this type of endgame, which shows the basic idea that white wants to achieve, moving the rook without losing the pawn without any compensation. In the following positions, black will pose more problems for white to achieve that goal, and make it harder to win. Sometimes it is possible for the defending side to get a draw with correct technique. In this position, black tries to use our king as a shield against our own rook from checks, so that we cannot promote. My question for you is, can white win, or is it a draw? The answer is that white wins. So what should you do against this attempt to win? The solution to this is quite simple. We simply walk our king to c5, while the black king follows us, and we play this crazy move, rook c8. Did we just give our last pawn away? Yes, we did. But now we win in style, king b6 check, attacking both the rook and the king. Black has to save the king and lose the rook. If black tries instead to give checks to our king, we can simply move towards the a file and stop the checks by attacking the rook. Once the rook moves out of danger, the king has absolutely no shelter from the storm and gets a fatal blow, and now we win the game again. So we know that if the king is on the 6th rank or below, and is not on the same file as the pawn, we can move our rook out of the way of the pawn with tempo, which is the key to win. But what if the king makes it to the 7th rank? How can you know if you're winning? First, if the king is on b7 or c7, it is a guaranteed draw as the king is too close to our pawn. I will explain deeper later. In this example, the king is not on c7 or b7. So the next step is to see if the move rook h8 is possible. In this case, it is, so we have to play that move. But doesn't that just give up the pawn? We are making black take the pawn in our terms, because now the king and rook are lined up on the same rank, so rook h7 skewers the pieces. But instead of king e7, black plays king g7 this time. Does this make a difference? Remember to use the checklist. Is the king 2 squares or less from my pawn? No. Is rook h8 possible? No, because the king would just take our rook for free. So because of this, the game is a draw with best play from both sides. White may try to bring the king closer to the pawn, but black has the luxury of just shuffling the king back and forth between g7 and h7. But the moment the king defends the pawn, black has to immediately check the king away from the defense of the pawn, and once the king no longer defends the pawn, black can continue with their king shuffling business. If white attacks the rook will simply move along the a file, and when there is no threat, the black king will just move back and forth on g7 and h7. The only 2 squares that prevent checks on the 8th rank or skew ideas with rook h8. And once the king defends the pawn again, black must check the king away and black draws the game down a pawn. Earlier I mentioned that if the king is in this red square, or 2 moves from the pawn, the game is also a draw. Why is that so? On king a6 or b6, the king attacks the pawn, so rook b8 is met with king takes a7. On king c6, while rook c8 check may seem to be winning for white, king b7 ends all hope for white as the king controls the promotion square. On king c7, black is threatening king b7, forcing the rook to abandon the pawn. If rook h8 is played, allowing rook takes a7 so that rook h7 is askew, the king and the rook are too close, and king b6 defends the rook and saves the game. So now that we know how the defending side can draw or the attacking side can win, there is one last factor that can allow the attacking side to win besides having an extra piece. It is having another passed pawn. In case you didn't know, pawns and kings are not considered pieces. Only queens, rooks, knights and bishops are considered pieces. With that being said, let's take a look at an example of how the second passed pawn can help to win the game, and how it won't. So we already know that if the defending king and pawn are on opposite sides of the board, the king must stay on these two squares to not allow the rook to move away and allow promotion. If the second passed pawn is on the B, C, D or E files, then it is a win for white. The reason is very simple. Both the black king and rook are unable to stop the pawn from promoting. The rook has to stay on the A file to keep watch of the pawn, and the king has to stay on G7 and H7 to keep the rook in front of the pawn. This means that the rook is unable to take the free pawn on E4 without letting the other promote and forcing the sacrifice of the rook. So black starts checking to slow the advance of the E pawn. The easiest thing to do is to use our pawn as an umbrella from rook checks, and if black pins the pawn, we can simply move up and block the check by advancing the pawn. So we continue to advance the pawn, but now when black pins us, we don't have the option to move up beside the pawn with king f6 because of the black king. So what should we do now? Since we are unable to use the pawn as a shield from checks, we have to do the tedious work of moving closer to the rook and stopping the checks before pushing the pawn. Remember that the black rook cannot take the e-pawn or the a-pawn promotes, so they continue checking until we attack the rook and force it away. Now we push the pawn closer to promotion. Now black starts checking along the files, so we have to approach the rook again, and once we attack the rook, we push the pawn again. One final check, but we attack it again, and once the rook moves, we promote and win. So you can see how black cannot do anything to stop our pawns from promoting against the B, C, D and E pawns. But what about the F, G and H pawns? Will they be enough to win for white? Let's take a look at the G pawn first. So we start pushing the pawn to G5 and G6. Notice that unlike the E pawn earlier, the pawn is unable to continue advancing because the king is in the way and will never move. Black will simply shuffle the rook along the A file and the white king will never be able to force the black king out of the way of the pawn. If the king tries to walk all the way the other side of the board to hopefully support the pawn, the rook will just make random moves along the A file until the king defends the pawn. Then the rook will check the king away and the game is a draw. The same thing applies to the H pawn. We can push to H4, H5, and H6 with check, but black does not get distracted with the pawn and remembers that the king must stay on G7 and H7 only. So king H7 blocks the pawn and the game is a draw again. Now the last pawn we have yet to discover, the F pawn. After F4, F5 and F6 check, you might notice a difference here from the G and H pawns. The king is unable to block the pawn with king F7 because the king now leaves the G7 and H7 squares. Do you remember what to play here? That's right, it's Rook H8, threatening promotion and of course, Rook H7, skewering the king and rook. If the rook were to capture the pawn, it leaves the A file, so white promotes. If the king takes the pawn, the king is no longer on the 7th rank, so rook f8 check is possible, leading to promotion. If black continues with the strategy and plays king h7, then f7 happens, and the pawn is promoting. Black can only delay the inevitable by checking, but once they run out of checks, we promote and win the game. So that's all for this endgame. I hope you liked this video, and I'll see you in the next video.